Okay, so not so long ago I was speaking about what I regard as a very dark aspect of Britain's past, which was the usage of capital punishment, specifically public hangings. And I spoke a bit about the history of that, the background to it, and so on. I want to cover in this video some more punishments which were supposedly more minor, but which by today's standards would be regarded as very barbaric. So two that I'll begin with is the pillory and the stocks. Now the pillory was basically a wooden plank with three holes in it, one hole for the head and two smaller holes for the hands, and the plank would be sort of two pieces put together and probably nailed in at the side, screwed in at the side. So the accused, the convicted I should say, would be locked in position, so their head and their hands are basically like this. You may have seen this in a film, you may have seen it in other parts of the world. Certainly it's not unique to Britain. And the person would have been propped up, so in most situations they would have been standing upright, well crouched over, because obviously their head was in this position. By all accounts, the pillory was a very barbaric thing. It was supposedly for more minor crimes which wouldn't herald a full death penalty, but very often it resulted in death anyway, because, or if not death, very serious injury. There's sort of this concept, sometimes when the pillory is depicted on TV, it's sort of like people think, oh, it's rotten vegetables, and maybe there's a perception that it was unpleasant but not that deadly. Actually, there was very little restrictions on what the mob could use, so stones were thrown at the victim as well. And if they were a particularly unpopular criminal, then sometimes the mob's treatment of them would have been utterly barbaric, and it was basically like a lynching in everything but name. Personally, I think it's one of our very worst, because the person would have been locked into position. There's absolutely no way they could have defended themselves. It would have been an absolute nightmare. And this usually lasted a minimum of 1 hour, and sometimes as long as at least 2 hours. So you can imagine fixing a position for 2 hours, people throwing anything at you. It's a very barbaric thing. And the thing about this would be that the entire population would be viewing it, just like public hangings. So you would have young children watching this, and the parents who were desensitized then would have encouraged the children to do likewise. So young children were brought up with a brutal mindset that this sort of behaviour was okay. The sort of thing, one of the common sort of crimes that would have brought on the pillory was perjury. For example, false oath in a court of law, which is still considered a serious crime, and it wasn't a victimless crime. But the pillory was also used for other purposes as well. It wasn't until the 1960s that homosexuality was decriminalised in this country. So sodomy was a crime that could result in the pillory, which by today's standards, of course, in most developed countries is regarded as an absolute abomination. I mean, persecution of that is regarded as an abomination. There were some famous victims of the pillory. Daniel Defoe, the famous writer, was put in the pillory. He actually got lenient treatment from the crowd because they sympathised with him. When he was put in the pillory in 1703 for seditious libel, he was regarded as a hero and was actually pelted with flowers. So they were sending out a message there. But there was numerous other people who were not so fortunate. There was a woman called Mother Needham, and she was basically a well-known prostitute and brothel house owner. They were known as bawdy houses between the 17th and 18th centuries. And she was charged with keeping an unruly house, I believe that is what they described it as, and she was sentenced to the pillory twice. I believe that on the second occasion, the crowd was so big that a young boy was actually killed in the crush. He was impaled on a spike in the crush to see this happening. And the anger from the crowd was so bad that she apparently lost her sight. She didn't die immediately, but she would have died in agony not long afterwards from the injuries that she sustained. Another example was the following year, 1732. One John Waller, was sentenced to the pillory. He was a highwayman and perjurer. He was sentenced to the pillory after giving false information to the courts from which he benefited financially. And he was killed by the brother of someone who he had implicated, and that had resulted in the person's execution. So quite often things like this were a way for criminals or those involved in the criminal world to get revenge on each other. So it was actually a very brutal sort of it brutalized society in that sense. And this was a society, remember, with no organized police force, and whereby justice was highly questionable. Evidence was flimsy often at best. It wasn't until the late 18th century when William Garrow developed this concept of innocent until proven guilty that the real idea of justice finally started being developed, in my opinion. Before that, yes, there were trials, but very often they were deeply corrupt and based on extremely flimsy evidence, and class. Class was a big deciding factor. If you look at the series Garrow's Law, I think that's an excellent series. It really gives an insight into what judicial life was like in the 18th century, late 18th century. So I strongly recommend looking at that series. There is actually one scene where it shows a thief-taker general. He's not a pleasant character. He's not a particularly sympathetic character. He implicates innocent people because of his own greed. But he ends up in the pillory, and regardless of what sort of character it is, it's hard to take any pleasure from seeing a man pelted to death, basically. But that is realistic. It's the sort of thing that happened. So that was the pillory. The first time the word was used in English goes back to 1274. The last time the pillory was used was, by the way, in 1816. Its usage was more restricted to just perjury, from what I understand. It says that the last time it was used was against one Peter James Bossy, who was this was in Leicester, I believe. He was convicted of willful and corrupt perjury in the year 1830. He was offered a choice of 7 years penal transportation or 1 hour in the pillory, and he chose the latter. So that's the last recorded usage of the pillory in the United Kingdom, which is almost, well, let's work this out, 184 years ago. So that's a long time back. It was abolished actually before public hangings were, which is interesting. Now, the other punishment, by the way, one of the most famous pillories was at Charing Cross, which is now a busy railway terminus in central London. And there's a famous picture of that. If you look at the Wikipedia page, there's an image depicting that. The other form of punishment which I was going to talk about, which is somewhat similar to the pillory, is the stocks. The stocks would be, instead of the hands and neck, it would be just the feet. Again, it would be a similar principle. Often the stocks were for things like public drunkenness, and beggars were often victims of the stocks. They would be put in there for up to an hour, sometimes all day, and people would throw rotten fruit and vegetables at them. In my own opinion, it wasn't as bad as a pillory because they had a bit more flexibility. As far as I know, their hands weren't tied in as well, so it was not quite as severe as the pillory. And I haven't heard of any cases of anyone dying in the stocks, whereas I have heard of cases of people dying in the pillory. Nevertheless, by today's standards, it would be considered pretty barbaric, holding someone in a fixed position so that the mob could basically do what they want for an hour or two. And if you think of something like public drunkenness, now that's, today we would consider alcoholism an illness that needs to be treated, and the only way someone would be punished is if they're being violent and disorderly. So the last recorded usage of the stocks was in 1872, I believe, at Newcastle, Emlyn in Wales, although several other places claim that they last used it. But by the late Victorian period it was very, very rarely used anyway, so it was really starting to die out of fashion by the beginning of the century. So both of these things were used for so-called more, let's say, crimes which didn't generally result in the death penalty. Not to say that those crimes couldn't also result in the death penalty. There was different circumstances with each case. In the 18th century and well into the 19th century, there was other forms of punishment for things like theft. That would include, for instance, branding. That meant the criminal would be permanently scarred. It could be branding on the ear, it could be branding on the chest, with a hot iron. That was considered a more minor punishment. There was a thumbscrew that was popular in the 16th century, which was a form of torture, essentially. By the way, talking of torture, what we would today describe as torture, although it's a term that's sometimes thrown around these days, but torture to gain a confession was officially abolished in this country, in England, in 1646, and I believe earlier in Scotland. In fact, we called it the rack. That would be basically, it's been depicted in many films, when the victim would be stretched, literally stretched, and the pain would be excruciating. This was very commonly used in the 16th century, and it was used well into the 17th century. I believe the last case, by the way, Guy Fawkes is one of the most famous victims, and there's a famous signature that he made. He was one of the people involved in the gunpowder plot to assassinate King James the First, King James the Sixth, and he was actually, his signature afterwards is very shaky because he'd been a victim of the rack. This was a particularly barbaric form of torture. It was nicknamed the Duke of Exeter's daughter, because John Holland, the second Duke of Exeter, was a constable of the Tower of London in 1447. I believe the last time it was used in England was around the middle of the Civil War, 1646. I think I read somewhere that was the last time it was used. There were other forms of punishment. In the 18th, well, let's say between the 17th and early 19th century, transportation was a common punishment, penal transportation, particularly sending criminals to the New World. One reason was prisons in Britain at that time were overcrowded, filthy places. Prison hulks were used, which were basically old ships. So increasingly this idea of sending them to the New World, particularly Australia and the colonies in Australia, Botany Bay was one location, would be seen as, I guess it was a way of the judiciary, of the freeing up the legal system. This was a mixed thing, because often the voyages were hazardous and many people died of disease on the way. But if they survived the voyage, there are examples of people surviving transportation and living lives to then end up with a very profitable lifestyle, because they would have then become landowners over time. They would have maybe changed their fortune. So it was sort of a mixed thing. Nevertheless, it was a feared punishment. One of the assassins of Queen Victoria, or I should say would-be assassins of Queen Victoria, there were several assassination attempts on her, was sentenced to transportation. I think I covered burning at the stake in the last video. Burning at the stake was reserved generally for heretics. It was used in the 16th century, especially at the time when there was a major schism between Catholicism and the new religion which we now know as Protestantism. It's particularly during the reign of Queen Mary. There's a very good opening scene in the film Elizabeth from 1998, which shows 3 martyrs of the Church of England being burned, the 3 bishops. I forget their names now, Latimer, Ridley, and I forget specifically what scene that's depicting, but there was martyrs on both sides who were basically burned alive for having the wrong religion, which by today's standards makes the Taliban look almost moderate. It's very, very barbaric. But that wasn't used for a very long time. Its earliest recorded usage was mid-15th century, and it wasn't really used. The last recorded usage was, I believe, 1797 in Scotland. and by that time it was also for things like coining and witchcraft as well, was another reason. There was, of course, different countries in Europe had different periods of witch scares, and then there was the famous Salem witch trials in the New World in Massachusetts. But in England, the peak of the witch hunting era was about the 1620s and 1630s, I believe. There was one Matthew Hopkins, the witch finder general, who himself fell under suspicion because he was so effective at it. So burning as a punishment lasted a few centuries, but it wasn't as long lasting as other punishments like hanging. I'm trying to think of others. I may have forgotten other forms of punishment. Hung, drawn and quartered was a common punishment from perhaps the mid-13th century right up until the early 17th century. And this would very often be for traitors. It was considered one of the most brutal punishments of all, because they would be hung very often until not quite dead. Then they would be disemboweled. If they were still alive, they would then be subjected to smelling their own organs being burned, although likely they would have passed out with the sheer agony of this. And apologies for being crude, but the reality is very often they would have been wallowing in their own excrement, because not just because of the fear, but their bodily functions would have given way because of the sort of torture that was being inflicted upon them. Now, I made a video about the film Braveheart, and I mentioned there was a lot of historical inaccuracies in that. One thing that they did get right was the torture scene at the end was that barbaric. That's not an exaggeration, it really was that barbaric, and it shows just how brutal a world this was. So it's very hard. A lot of people who've seen the film say it's hard to watch that scene, although I'm a bit skeptical that he could have shouted out freedom after being disemboweled. I think it would have been physically hard to do that. But anyway, the gunpowder plotters, those who survived, i.e. weren't killed in the shootout in the Midlands, were executed by being hung, drawn and quartered. It was a very, very barbaric death. Another punishment that was used later on in the 18th century was being flagellated, whipped through the streets. That was for more minor crimes, for example pewter pot stealing, which was a big problem at that time. They would have been publicly shamed. The ironic thing about all of this is Britain wasn't even the worst country. It wasn't the most extreme country in terms of punishment. If you look at some of the Germanic states around Central Europe, they had even more barbaric punishments. There's a museum in Prague, in the Czech Republic, which shows a lot of the torture devices that were used, and it's hard to comprehend that human beings could have been so absolutely vicious and cruel. But then again, when you look at the world today, when you look at some of the reports that Amnesty International uncovers, there's some parts of the world that are really not that much better today. The Uzbek regime has been accused of boiling dissidents alive, and that is today. Now, that's something, by the way. Boiling was reportedly used in the reign of Henry VIII, but it wasn't used very commonly. So I think I've covered most of the things that were used. Most of these punishments, thank goodness, were abolished long time ago. Because in the 20th century, we started to learn more about the idea of human rights, and that started to enter more into the psyche of what is proportionate punishment. Now, one point I made in the last video is, if you take a stance against this sort of stuff, you're sometimes seen as being sympathetic to criminals. Now, I'm sure many of the people who suffered these punishments were not angels. I'm sure they'd done some pretty terrible crimes. But the sort of punishments that took place in the past in this country, I find it something very unnerving about thinking about some of those things, especially things like the pillory. It defies belief that human beings could be so cruel to fellow human beings, regardless of what those people have done, because that's an example of society being just as bad as the criminal. It is very hard to imagine that people could be so desensitized. But then again, when I read some comments online today, there are people who honestly seem to have a mentality that would advocate that even today. Particularly with serious crimes like child murder and so on, you do get people that would probably say, oh, they deserve that sort of thing. My opinion might be controversial, but I don't believe that as a civilized society we should do that to anybody, no matter how heinous a crime. I think that the most serious crimes should get very long, tough terms behind bars. I think they should be denied freedoms that law-abiding citizens enjoy. But as a society we must never ever return to this. Especially if we lecture other countries on human rights, we must never ever allow ourselves to return to what we were in the past. And we must never forget what actually happened. Because the punishments that I've mentioned, and I'm sure I've probably forgotten something, because there was a lot of different things. I've only covered some of them well-known ones. It's hard to comprehend that on these shores these sort of things really did happen in the past. By the way, I'll just mention briefly, one other thing was the Waketown Martyrs. They were two young Covenanter girls, young women, who were tied to stakes and drowned at sea. I'm going to add in a few more now that I've remembered. The gibbet was a common punishment. That would be the corpse of a condemned person would be left to rot basically in a cage. And very often there became a morbid sort of shrine around the gallows, especially for popular criminals. There's even accounts of the bones of rotten criminals being used as pipe cleaners and this sort of thing. Very, very morbid. Very hard for us to comprehend today. Sometimes, especially in the case of religious martyrs, the point where they were executed became a sort of point of pilgrimage. In my own opinion, the further back these things go, the better, but that doesn't mean we should ever forget what happened, because the sort of things that did happen would be precisely the sort of things that Amnesty International would be absolutely shaming today, and rightly so. We have developed a long way as a nation, and I believe we must never ever go back to that time. I also believe that criminals should face consequences for their crimes, especially crimes against the person, especially crimes that destroy lives. There should be no sympathy, no sort of leniency for those sort of crimes, but the punishment must not resort to the level of what the criminal has done, because then it is just blind vengeance. Then it's just the state and society reducing itself to the level of the criminal, and that makes us all barbarians. So regardless of how heinous the crime is, I don't believe that society should ever reduce itself to the level of the criminal. And this is why I berated the organisation known as Britain First, which is a far-right organisation. They actually want a return to this sort of shit. They want a Britain whereby this sort of stuff happens again. I say, no way. We must never ever allow ourselves to get back to that situation. So yes, criminals should be punished. I'm no bleeding heart when it comes to crime. But I hope that all the things I have spoken about will maybe make people think a little bit before they say we should bring any of this stuff back. Because what we're talking about is complete barbarism, and it desensitizes the whole of society. So I'll leave it there. Sorry that this video is a little bit long, but I do think it's important to discuss everything, and thank you for watching.